As Series 2 is developed, Pokemon like Iron Bundle, Flutter Mane, Iron Hands, Amoonguss, and Goldengo have all dominated the metagame, with a huge chunk of players choosing to use them. But there's been a core rising in popularity that has an advantage on all of those Pokemon. Let's take a look at that core and how it generates those advantages. So the core that I was talking about is the Talon Tusk Mane Core, which involves these three Pokemon here. And this core actually already saw some usage at the Oceanic International with the player Alex Underhill using it and getting ninth place, which is a pretty impressive result. And I believe we'll probably be seeing more of this core alongside some of its common partners in the future. So what we'll do is go over each of these Pokemon individually and go over their strengths and weaknesses, and then we'll go over how they synergize as a whole, and then we'll go over some of the weaknesses that they have as a whole, and then we'll end it with some partner Pokemon that you can pair with this core to kind of help negate those weaknesses or have answers for them. So first up we have Talonflame, which is a really fast Pokemon, and Talonflame gets access to the ability Gale Wings as well, which means that its flying moves are going to have their priority increased by 1, which is really important because Talonflame gets access to Tailwind, which means that it's one of 2 priority Tailwind users, and the other common flying move that it's going to use is Brave Bird, which can also be useful for attacking Amoonguss or Flutter Mane, or maybe opposing Great Tusks or something like that, just to get good super effective damage or stab damage off. And in addition to that, also get some pretty good supportive moves like Taunt or Will-O-Wisp. And Taunt can be used to shut down, opposing supportive Pokemon, and Will-O-Wisp can be used to shut down opposing physical attackers. And in addition to that, it's a little bit more uncommon, but Talonflame can run things like Quick Guard, to kind of shut down priority moves and maybe enable its partner to not be afraid of Fake Out or maybe Jet Punch or things like that or Extreme Speed. And Talonflame also gets access to Feint, which is not used very often, but it does shut down Wide Guard, which means if your partner is clicking Earthquake or something like that, you can kind of deny that ability and that can catch your opponents off guard, or you can just use it to kind of press your offensive pressure while you have Tailwind up even more by stopping people from protecting to stall that out. That can be pretty useful there, I think, even though it's not used that much. So next, we're going to talk about Talonflame's items, and the first item I want to talk about is Covert Cloak, and that's very useful because it stops Talonflame from flinching from Fake Out. So even though your opponent might be able to take away your priority, they won't be able to take away you clicking Tailwind on turn 1, which is really useful. Apart from that, you can also run safety goggles to kind of stop Amoonguss from keeping Talonflame busy, or maybe if Talonflame has taunt and you're worried about your opponent having mirror herb, you can get that second taunt off without getting put to sleep. Or if you don't really care about the Amoonguss, you want to attack something else, safety goggles can be useful for that. It's a pretty straightforward item. In addition to safety goggles and covert cloak, also worth mentioning some more offensive options like Life Orb or Sharp Beak. I don't think they're necessarily the best in this current format, but if your other items are already on different Pokemon on your team, that can be a useful way to make Talonflame's Brave Bird hit even harder, maybe for particular calcs that you're interested in. And finally, I think it's worth mentioning Wide Lens as an option, and you would really only consider running this if you have Will-O-Wisp. It would just make your Will-O-Wisp more consistent, and that gives you a higher chance of maybe winning some games where that is a game-winning play to make. So next, we're going to be talking about Talonflame's Terra type options, and I think this kind of falls in line with that Covert Cloak option. So you're thinking about Ghost Terra type, that can just make you completely immune to Fake Out. So if you Terra Ghost, you will actually keep your priority because the Fake Out won't do any damage, and then Tailwind will come up earlier. So maybe if their plan was to like Fake Out and then hit you with a really fast Pokemon like Iron Bundle or Flutter Mane, Terra Ghost can prevent that from happening. So that can be really useful in niche cases. And alternatively, you can run something like Terra Flying, and that'll just make you do even more damage if you need to, or potentially drop your fire type if you think a Jet Punch is incoming or something like that. And I think that pretty much concludes Talonflame, so we'll move on to Great Tusk now. So Great Tusk is a really strong physical attacker, and it actually has pretty decent or pretty strong physical bulk as well. But unfortunately, its special defense stat really holds it back on that end, and its speed isn't that great either. So despite having a pretty impressive HP stat, uh, Great Tusk can really be thought of more like a glass cannon kind of Pokemon, and it does kind of need support to help it get into those higher speed tiers. Otherwise, something like a Flutter Mane or an Iron Bundle is just going to be able to one-shot Great Tusk before it does anything. So first, let's kind of go over some of the items that you might use on Great Tusk. I personally think that something like Focus Sash or Assault Vest is really useful in Great Tusk because it can kind of help mitigate its weaknesses in it gets to stick around for a little bit longer, and it's a little bit harder for your opponent to deal with that as opposed to some of the other popular items, which may be like a Life Orb or Choice Band, right? Or you can even run Booster Energy if you want to do Booster Energy Attack, or maybe you can also do Booster Energy Speed as a way to kind of help with your speed. Although I think even with that, you're still going to be slower than a lot of the other popular Pokemon in the format, like Booster Energy Iron Bundle or Booster Energy Flutter Mane, or Booster Energy, a lot of different Paradox Pokemon. But yeah, those are also options that you consider. I still think leaning more defensively with your item choice is going to be the move for Great Tusk. So now we can kind of talk about its moves. And the popular moves for Great Tusk are going to be Close Combat and Ground Type Close Combat, which is Headlong Rush. And then also very popular is going to be something like the Earthquake, which is basically just a really powerful move in the right circumstances. If you have the right partner, if your partner can protect and your opponent isn't really set up to deal with it, it can just sweep teams, which is very good to have as an alternative option. Also, it gets access to Ice Spinner if you wanted to maybe try and break terrains or hit some of the flying type Pokemon with a super effective, since your other moves are kind of not so great into flying type Pokemon. In addition to Ice Spinner, um, Great Tusk also gets access to moves like Iron Head, right? Or Knockoff, just kind of as more coverage options that you can take. Also Rock Slide is in there. And it's worth noting that he does get Protect like every other Pokemon, and I think that's a really useful move to have with him, especially if you're doing something like pairing him with that Talonflame. As Talonflame will often like the Tailwind, and then it's kind of a guessing game as to what your opponent's going to target on that turn, and if you Protect, that can kind of help keep you safe while Talonflame gets that Tailwind ready for Great. All right. And lastly, we'll just talk about the Terra types. Pretty straightforward. Great Tusk usually likes to run Terra Ground just to make its ground types moves even stronger, and also to drop that fighting typing defensively sometimes to maybe avoid like the Moon Blasts or flying type moves or something like that. And alternatively, you can also run something like a Terra Steel to kind of get some resistances to things that you were already weak to before, like Psychic and Fairy, as I already. And I think that pretty much covers Great Tusk, so now we'll talk about Flutter Mane. So Flutter Mane is a really fast special attacker that has also a pretty remarkable special defense stat, although unfortunately for it, its HP and defense are abysmal. So that also gives Flutter Mane a very glass cannon feel, kind of in the reverse direction of Great Tusk. So first we can talk about the item options for Flutter Mane. And for Flutter Mane, there's actually a lot of variety that you can go through, but we'll just list some of the more common items here. Focus Sash is one, just to make sure that Flutter Mane lives, kind of same idea as Great Tusk, although obviously you can't run Focus Sash on both of them, so you have to make a decision there. Booster Energy is actually really good on Flutter Mane for speed purposes. If you're up against, an Iron Bundle that doesn't have that, or if you're up against opposing Flutter Manes that don't have that, it can definitely give you an advantage. And if your opponent sets up Tailwind, Booster Energy Flutter Mane might be faster than Pokemon under a lot of the slower Pokemon under Tailwind, which it can be very useful too. And in addition to that, it also gets the more offensive options like Life Orb and Choice Specs, which are pretty straightforward items that just make you do more damage. For its move pool, this is actually where Flutter Mane has a lot of depth to it. It has the more common options, which almost all the Flutter Manes will run in Moonblast and Shadow Ball. And then also has Dazzling Gleam as a multi-hit option. And in addition to that, we also have a lot of supportive moves here. So we have Icy Wind, which can be used for speed control. Definitely pairs well with that booster energy set. We also have Taunt, although you might not want to run that if Talonflame's already running it. Also get access to Perish Song, which can be very useful. Wolf actually used a Perish Song Flutter Mane to in the Orlando Regional. And also gets access to Trick Room, and as an important part of that Trick Room, he also gets Imprison, so you can use that as like an anti-Trick Room mon. I don't think it's necessarily the best use case of Flutter Mane, but it's certainly possible to do that. And then he gets lots of other moves, which can just be like coverage moves, and these might make sense if you're in the choice spec set. So something like Mystical Fire for the steel types who resist fairy, and also have things like Power Gem and Thunderbolt. So, just more damage you can get through, and yeah, Energy Ball. So, just more options that you can maybe carry depending on what you're looking at if you're running that choice spec sec, or if you feel like you don't really need a supportive option for Flutter Mane, you can take a move like this instead. So, for Terra types, Flutter Mane actually likes to kind of go Terra Fairy typically, because this will drop your Ghost type weakness in that Flutter Mane mirror when they're using something like the Shadow Ball, right? And it'll make your Moonblast and Dazzling Gleam do a lot more damage, which opponents might not be expecting, or you can just use that, if they're expecting it anyways, to still be really powerful. And alternatively, you can also do something like Terra Grass to kind of help with how Amoonguss can sometimes be an issue for Flutter Mane. You can just say, hey, I'm going to ignore you now. Not really that big of a threat. And given your really strong special defense, making yourself vulnerable to super effective Pollen Puffs really isn't that big of a deal. And you can also just go full defense and have a Terra Steel, and that can really help with dodging a lot of other attacks, that you might get hit with. So I think that pretty much covers Flutter Mane, and we'll kind of go over all three of these guys as a whole. So I've already alluded to some of the synergies from earlier in the video, but I'm going to restate some of them here just so it's all in this section. And so the first thing I want to mention is that Talonflame has that flying typing, which can allow for Great Tusk to go for those earthquakes, which can really help fully enable Great Tusk without him having to worry about who hurting his ally. Next thing is Talonflame still has that priority Tailwind, which is really good at enabling Great Tusk to just be an offensive sweeper that's not too worried about Flutter Manes and Iron Bundles anymore, or any other special attacker that outsped him before. And it just allows him to start picking up knockouts and putting your opponent in a very reactionary position to what you're doing. And in Pokemon, it's typically better to be in the proactive stance than it is in the reactive stance. And this Tailwind is actually useful for Flutter Mane as well. Is an issue for Flutter Manes can be opposing Iron Bundles, which outspeed it, and then Iron Bundle will drop an Icy Wind to lower Flutter Mane's speed even further, and then Flutter Mane becomes very vulnerable to those mid and high speed physical attackers that previously it would have just been able to one shot or do great damage to. Now it gets outsped, and they just take him out. And Talonflame's Tailwind can help Flutter Mane kind of flip that dynamic on its head, given Iron Bundle's very weak special defense stat. Flutter Mane's now poised to knock out Iron Bundle instead of vice versa. So that can be really good setting up positive matchups for you. And this works against opposing Flutter Mane too. Now you're not necessarily worried about that speed tie of who's going to get the Shadow Ball off first. You're going to get your Tailwind, and the Shadow Ball's coming off first. Or Talonflame can just Brave Bird the opposing Talonflame if they're not sashed, and then you pick up a knockout that way. But these synergies go beyond just Talonflame being a good supportive option for Great Tusk and Flutter Mane. In addition to that, Great Tusk actually can hit a lot of the types that people will turn into to avoid Flutter Mane, or maybe bring just like fire types and steel types and poison types, those kinds of things to mitigate the damage that Flutter Mane's doing. They're actually setting themselves up to be in a world of pain later when you bring out that Great Tusk in the late game. So if you can do some kind of planning around that, and it can be easy to kind of plan around that to put yourself in a positive position to maybe take advantage of your opponent's early mistakes, or them not thinking far enough ahead to be like, hey, there's a Great Tusk that's going to be an issue for me here, and they're only worried about the Flutter Mane that they're seeing at the time, or maybe they're forced to be worried about the Flutter Mane because of the kind of damage that you're going to pressure if they don't Terra. Like, for instance, Annihilate Terra firing to avoid Flutter Mane, but then later just getting knocked out by Great Tusk, who also outspeeds him with a ground move later on. So that kind of covers the synergies, and now we can move into some of the weaknesses of this core, and then from there, finish out and talk about how do we deal with those weaknesses. So some of the weaknesses for this core can be these bulky Intimidate Pokemon that are physical attackers, because they can kind of negate Great Tusk by intimidating him and lowering that attack stat. And they can also be a problem for Flutter Mane, who can't necessarily one-shot them, and then they end up taking Flutter Mane out later with a physical attacking move, because it's very frail to those. So that would be something like the Arcanine, or Salamence, or Gyarados. Those are all pretty strong into that team, especially these flying type ones here, which I'll get into more later. Arcanine not necessarily, because he might be forced to do something like Terra Water or Terra Grass to not still die to the Headlong Rush afterwards, even after getting that Intimidate off. Especially if you're able to set up that Tailwind and then he's not able to get the burn off before you move. In addition to the bulky Intimidators, Trick Room teams are also going to be pretty difficult for you to deal with. Not necessarily because you can't stop the Trick Room, but because Indeedee Armor Rogue is kind of that hard Trick Room lead that's very popular right now. And those special attackers are a really big threat to Great Tusk. And Flutter Mane, despite having that great special defense, still isn't that resistant to the Expanding Force combo from Armor Rogue. And you still can't stop the Trick Room with just a taunt, because it's very common for both Armor Rogue and Indeedee to have that Trick Room, so you can maybe stop Indeedee from clicking Follow Me, but then the Trick Room's set up and now Armor Rogue is poised to sweep your team. So that can be kind of problematic. And another thing to be on the lookout for is those priority-based teams, which is really going to be around, the Palafin and the Dragonite. And those can, break the Gale Wings on Talonflame if they outspeed Talonflame, or if you've been hurt before, or they can pick up big knockouts and kind of ignore that tailwind that you set up. So that can be another problematic thing you might need to look out for. And in addition to that, I know I have some repeats here, but for a different reason, bulky flying types can also be very problematic for this team, kind of in the same way as the Intimidate users are. But it's more that Great Tusk just can't deal good damage to them anyways. Even with the Ice Spinner, it's not stab. It's not going to be doing a ton. And they're going to have a super effective move that's kind of forcing you to Terra to drop that fighting weakness. And then against Flutter Mane, it's the same situation where they're just bulky enough to take that hit and then pick up a knockout in return. So that can be something like, Dragonite, Gyarados, Salamence. And then, people who like the Terra flying, like King Gambit and Tyranitar and Roaring Moon. Those can all be problems for your team. So let's go into the next section of this video, just talking about how do we actually deal with some of these Pokemon. What can we put on our team to help mitigate these weaknesses? So for mitigating these weaknesses, Defiant users are going to be a really good way of dealing with those bulky Intimidate Pokemon. So that's going to be like Annihilate, or it's going to be King Gambit. And King Gambit is especially good because it can also help out with those Psychic Terrain teams, since it's got that dark typing. And then if you are able to commit that Terra, you can be another supportive partner who's flying that allows Great Tusk to go for even more Earthquakes, as King Gambit will now be immune to them instead of getting hit for super by them. So King Gambit, I think, flows really well with this team. Is very cohesive with the team. So I think that's a very strong option to take. And also you have Dragonite, who can run Ice Spinner over Great Tusk, and Dragonite's in a much better position to try and eliminate that terrain. Expanding Force isn't as threatening to him, especially if you have multi-scale up. You can also run something like the Assault Vest on him, and he's kind of fine to take those Expanding Forces until he turns off the terrain. And then that can kind of set up, a Great Tusk to come in with Earthquakes later on and deal super effective damage to Armor Rogue, getting around that Follow Me. And then Dragonite can also be that ideal partner to let you do those Earthquakes and not be hurt by it as well due to his flying typing. So that can be pretty useful. And last year we have Iron Bundle, which, his typing is just going to gel well with the rest of the team. And his Freeze Dry is particularly going to be very helpful at dealing with those pesky, bulky flying types that are kind of a problem for the other Pokemon that I mentioned on the team. So Iron Bundle kind of fits well with just the typing purpose. And then he's also very fast, and you can still run things like the Icy Wind to get speed control that way if you don't necessarily want to click Tailwind with Talonflame, or maybe it's the Tailwind has gone out and then you need the Icy Wind for something else. And you could also run something like that Encore to kind of, punish opponents or make opponents think twice about clicking Protect, especially with how fast your team is going to be. So, yep, that kind of covers all of the partners there. And yeah, so I'll kind of pass it over to the end now. Hey guys, thanks so much for staying to the end of the video. Hopefully it can help you come up with some ideas for how you may want to run the core yourself, whether it's on ladder or in showdown or in a tournament or just to beat some of your friends. If you liked the video, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like on it and you subscribed. And again, thank you guys so much, and I'll catch you next time.